this lesson, we're going to show you how to play jazz chords on your ukulele, and you'll learn that they're not that hard, not that mysterious, and you don't just have to play jazz songs with jazz chords. You can play bluegrass and folk as well. So get your ukulele tuned up, sit down, get a cup of coffee, and let's get started. Well, before we begin, it behooves us to talk just a bit about what exactly is a jazz chord. Technically, there are many different definitions for what people consider a jazz chord to be. We're going to give you our sort of folksy interpretation, so please forgive us. Basically, jazz chords are spiced up chords to either play jazz songs or jazzed up regular songs. In other words, when you're playing jazz chords, it doesn't mean you have to be playing All of Me or Sweet Georgia Brown or something by Miles Davis. You can be playing a folk song that goes G, C, D and be adding in jazz chords to jazz it up. Secondly, jazz chords are created by either adding new notes or changing the notes already in the chord. So technically, for example, a seventh chord is a jazz chord. So really all you're doing is you're taking regular chord forms and either changing something, adding something, or tweaking that position in some way to get your jazz chord. In this lesson, we will focus on using them to jazz up existing music, particularly the blues. This is very useful as you will be able to use them in a jam session, not just for jazz songs. And before we begin, we're going to give you a lightning fast explanation of how chords are built in the first place. If you want to learn more about this, you're going to have to pick up one of our theory lessons at JamAlong.org. But suffice it to say that if you have a scale that goes 1 through 8, and you pick the first or root note, the third and the fifth notes of that scale and played them all together, that combination of notes from the scale, in other words the 1, 3, and 5, creates a chord, also known as a triad, or 3 notes. So that's the principle we're working on, and everything else we're adding or tweaking those given 1, 3, and 5 notes from the original triad. In jazz music, it's always wise to simplify things. The simpler you can get, the better when understanding a concept. So for example, what we like to say is there's only 2 ways that you can create a jazz chord. You can alter one of the existing tones within the chord, or you can add another tone on top of the chord. Let's look at the chart. So for example, if you have a changing pitch of notes already in the chord, it's called altered, an altered chord. Moving the third up or down a half step, suspended or minor, etc. And then in the other column you have extended, so you're adding notes on top of the existing chord. So a jazz chord basically changes the notes within the chord sometimes, and then adds new notes on top of the chord. Continuing this logic, there's really only 4 families of jazz chords that you want to learn at first, which basically helps you understand how these chords have been changed to create the moniker jazz chord. For example, the 7th chord is a regular major chord with the flatted 7th of the scale added. A minor 7 chord is simply a minor chord with the flatted 7th added. A 6th chord, really popular jazz chord and very important, is a regular major chord with the added 6th degree of the scale. And finally, the 9th chord, kind of like an extra spicy 7th chord, is simply a 7th chord with the 9th, quote unquote, in other words, a 2nd degree up an octave, added as well. Once again, we don't expect you to understand this all the way right now. This is theory, and we're just giving you a brief comb over so we can get to the real meat of the lesson and start strumming. Alright, the first principle of jazz is that if we're going to be jazzing up our folk and bluegrass songs, we want to know how to add a jazz chord and when. So the first principle is called chord substitution. So basically what that means is anytime there's a 7th chord being played, you can always throw in a 9th chord. So if someone's playing a G7 in a bluesy folk song, you could throw in a G9 and be real snazzy. Instead of a major chord, we can often substitute a 6th chord or a major 7th chord. And then finally, instead of a minor chord, we can substitute playing a minor 7th chord. With those principles in mind, let's look at a comparison of a basic chord progression and then a chord progression that we jazz up using the principles we just discussed. Okay, looking at this chord progression, you can see that basically what's happening here is we're strumming G, and we're strumming C, and then A7, and then D. That's not terribly jazzy by itself, but let's apply our principles, okay? So what we're going to do for that G chord is we're going to play a G6 chord, which luckily for us is simply just the regular G with the ring finger missing. Right away you can hear that sound. It's got that swingy, schmaltzy cruise ship vibe to it. Really appropriate for the ukulele. So here's the regular G. Here's the G6. Nice difference. And then for the next chord in our comparison progression, we have a C. We're going to substitute that with what's called a C major 7. Another really cool loungy shape that you want to adopt and use for all sorts of stuff. Okay? And then we have an A7 chord in the original progression that's already fairly jazzy. So we're going to throw in an A9th to make it even more sparky. All right? And then finally, instead of the D chord, we're putting in a D7. So let's play the first version of the chord progression to get warmed up, nice and slow, after the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nice, let's go again. Piece of cake, right? Well, let's jazz it up. First of all, we're going to use our G6 chord, which, as we talked about, is basically, luckily, simply the G chord without the ring finger. Then the C major 7 chord is really cute. We just pull our ring finger down 1 fret. Some folks may want to substitute with their middle finger. That's fine too. All right? And then for the A9 chord, we have our original A7, and we're popping on the ring finger here on the bottom string, the first string. And then for D7, once again, ironically, our jazz chords are easier than the original form. So instead of this version, we're taking off the pointer finger and having that third string opened up. We have D7, substituting the regular D. After the count of 4, let's play this jazzed up chord progression together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Very nice. A good metaphor for jazz progressions versus folk or bluegrass or country progressions, even rock and roll progressions, is that most mainstream pop and rock music uses primary colors. So you could say that the G chord would be red, the C chord would be blue, and the D chord might be yellow. In jazz, we don't just go red, blue, yellow. Jazz would prefer to go red, dark red, purple, purplish blue, blue to green, green to yellow. So it's like you took a water brush and kind of smooshed all the chords together. And if you listen to this progression, you can hear how the changes are more subtle and have a lot going on in them flavor-wise. For example, in the original progression, when we played G, going to C, a big change, primary colors. Now when we play G6, going to C major 7, notice that there's a lot of contained tones in both chords. This note here with the ring finger stays, called a pedal tone. Really cool. So all we're really doing is changing one note, barely changing the color, and yet it changes the key of the chord. G6, C major 7. Really exquisite. Have fun with that. Okay, be sure and rewind and play those progressions a bunch till those chords become second nature to you, and then let's move on to the blues. Why did we start with the blues? Well, there's 101 explanations for that. Basically, blues and jazz are very closely tied together. In fact, many would argue that jazz came out of the blues. I'm simply going to state that the blues progression, called the 12-bar blues or the G blues, A blues, whatever, is a great foundation for learning how to add in jazz chords. It's a great segue. So we're going to review the standard blues progression and then add some jazz chords to it. All right, the standard blues progression basically starts with a G7 chord, and that's a piece of cake. Let's take a quick look at it. So the ring finger is on the first string, the pointer finger is on the second string at the first fret, and the middle finger jumps over to the third string at the second fret. It's kind of like a pyramid shape, sort of like a half diamond. That is your G7. So pretty much we can just dive into this one and start strumming through it. It's not a bad idea to make sure you go through our lesson on how to play blues on the ukulele prior to going through this lesson, and it's available at JamAlong.org, and it really sets the stage for a lot of different blues strums. But it's fairly easy, so we're just going to jump in after the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. C7. Back to G7. Here's the C7. And then back to G7. And D7, last line. Measure goes back and it repeats. That's a great progression to learn for many reasons, making up silly lyrics about being down and out and under a bridge, or simply having fun with every other song in a folk jam that ends up being based on that chord progression. Well, as you can see, the blues is all about seventh chords. Every chord in that progression was a seventh chord. So what do? We're going to add ninth chords on top of that. Next chord progression is probably one of the biggest cliches in all of pop music. It's been called the popcorn progression, the vanilla progression. The technical term would be the 1-6-2-5, but basically it's a circle of chords that goes around and round and has been used countlessly by songwriters from the 40s on up to create crooning songs about unrequited love and other various male issues. So basically we're going to learn the vanilla version, meaning without all the crazy jazz chords first, and then we're going to go ahead and add the jazz chords in, because that's what we do. So let's look at the first version. We're calling it the vanilla version, and we're going to go from G to E minor to A minor to D7. Some of you will already recognize this as that familiar sound of so many pop songs. For example, if I was to play it in this rhythm, right? So the first chord in our vanilla 1-6-2-5 is our good friend G. Then we're going to E minor, which is not as bad as it looks. It's a paper dragon, okay? They fall in a row right there. And then we're going to A minor, right here. You can do it with a number of different finger sets. I tend to like to go middle and pinky, because I have some other strong digits ready to cause trouble if I want. And then finally our good friend D7, which we've done before. So G, E minor, A minor, D7. After the count of 4, let's play it nice and slowly together. Now, that's perfectly fine by itself. In fact, that should be bordering on enjoyable, just playing that in the vanilla fashion. But since this is a jazz chord lesson, we're going to add in some jazz chords to that progression. Let's take a look. So, instead of G, we're now going back to our friend G6 by removing that ring finger. And then instead of E minor, we're going to pop down a finger here on the first string up at the 5th fret to get what's called E minor 7. 1, 2, 3, 4. Second line. Let's try a version of the 1-6-2-5 progression, jazz chords number 2, at a faster tempo to get us really swinging. This is something you should build up to with lots of rewinding and practicing those earlier versions before you move on to this one, at risk of freaking yourself out. But let's go ahead and dive in for the Intrepid after the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.